The crisis in Syria has been creating some unexpected alliances on both sides. Joining me now, the Deputy Secretary of Defense in the George W. Bush administration, Paul Wolfowitz, and former Senator and Homeland Security Chairman Joe Lieberman. He's currently a co-chair of the Bipartisan Coalition for American Security. Welcome, gentlemen, to both of you. Paul Wolfowitz, how much responsibility do you feel, it's a bit of a cheeky question this, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway, for the lack of trust in this administration's claims about chemical weapons use by Assad, and people saying, well, it's all because of the lies over Iraq?
Well, Piers, there were no lies. Everybody saw the same intelligence, and a lot of people changed their tune about it afterwards. The real point is, look, people are concerned not because of the intelligence, I think, so much as they're concerned about the possibility of American casualties. And on that point, I would actually agree with Secretary Kerry, who says this is not Iraq, it's not Afghanistan. I don't think, frankly, if we don't use manned aircraft, there's no risk of American casualties in these strikes, at least. So that's a very important difference. I think it's fair of them to emphasize it. There's actually, though, a kind of eerie similarity in one respect, not to Iraq in 2003, but in 1991 there were reports that Saddam was dropping chemical weapons on the Shia as we were flying overhead watching the helicopters that we shouldn't have allowed to fly. Those reports were not confirmed until 12 years later, but then we had documents that showed that, yes, in fact, they had ordered chemical weapons used against the Shia. By that time, it was all over, of course.
Senator Lieberman, let's just play a couple of clips here from John Kerry. One is comparing the situation to the Nazis, and then what he said today. Watch this.
The real issue here is whether or not the Congress is going to stand up for international norms with respect to dictators that have only been broken twice until Assad, Hitler and Saddam Hussein. A very short-term effort that degrades his capacity to deliver chemical weapons without assuming responsibility for Syria's civil war. That is exactly what we're talking about doing. Unbelievably small, limited kind of effort.
You see, here's my problem, Senator. How do you say, on the one hand, this is the new Hitler we're dealing with, and on the other hand, say it's going to be an unbelievably small military action? That's not surely how anyone would have dealt with Adolf Hitler.
Well, I'm sure John Kerry wishes he hadn't said unbelievably small. I noticed in the briefing that Tony Blinken, the Deputy National Security Advisor, gave this afternoon, he described an attack as being limited but decisive. That's much better phraseology. But I'll tell you, Secretary Kerry had a point that we've been challenged here, not just by the use of gas, which links Bashar al-Assad to Adolf Hitler, but by all that happened during the 30s as the U.S. particularly watched, drawn by isolationism back, watched Hitler and the fascists move forward, and finally came in at a late hour, and thank God decisively. I mean, this is a real threat, and if we turn away from it, our allies are going to be shaken, our enemies are going to be emboldened, and inevitably we're going to be drawn into a much larger conflict later on that will cost us more in lives and treasure. That's what happens when you don't stop a bully, a thug, a murderer when he starts to murder, particularly when he murders his own people and with gas.
Right, Paul Wolfowitz, this is the problem I have with this, is that it seems to be clear, demonstrable evidence this time that Assad or people acting on his behalf have unleashed these chemical weapons on their own people. That would seem to be the general consensus of opinion. And yet the consensus of how to deal with it is it's terrible, but we can't do anything. And the best thing is America, which has been this great superpower, great global policeman, suddenly says, we're not doing that anymore. You're on your own. Is that the sensible way for America to go?
Frankly, I don't think it is. And this is about much more than the use of chemical weapons. I don't think anyone is denying that 100,000 plus Syrians have been killed and more than 2 million have been rendered refugees, and most of that is because of the brutality of this regime. And to say that we're not going to take responsibility for what's going on in Syria, we take responsibility when we do nothing, and we have done nothing for 30 months, 2.5 years, when I believe we had a lot that we could do, and still a lot that we can do, though not as much as we could have earlier, by empowering Syrians to defend themselves, to put this regime on the ropes, maybe even get a peaceful resolution of this terrible conflict. But we're not going to get a peaceful outcome as long as Assad can murder at will.
Senator Lieberman, the other flip of the coin, of course, for the American people is, look, you know, there's still over 7% unemployed. The economy's still in the tank. Incredibly expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with no apparent victory at the end of them, but lots of bloodshed to American troops and innocent people. And they say, we don't want any more of this. We don't want to be meddling around in the Middle East in perpetuity. What do you say to the American people who have that view? Because clearly from the polls, it's the majority.
Right. So I think we've got to say, first acknowledge that we've had periods like this in our history when Americans have pulled back, almost always following tough economic times and unpopular wars. But almost always that isolationism, if I can overstate the case, has forced us later into conflicts that were much more brutal. I also believe, Piers, that American public opinion on the question of Syria has been much more fluid than opponents of action as a result of the chemical weapons would argue. If you look at the polls at different times, if you talk about a limited action which is carried out by the American military from offshore, as it were, without boots on the ground and involving some international support, the support is actually over 50% in the various polls that have occurred in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I tell you, just to say something that, you know, I'm going to say it because I believe it. I believe that if on that Saturday afternoon, the day after Secretary Kerry gave the impassioned, I thought, compelling moral argument for us to respond to the Syrians' use of chemical weapons against their own people. If the president had come out on Saturday and instead of saying, I'm sending it to Congress, he said what we all expected, I've ordered an attack against Syria, limited and decisive, I think today public opinion would be very positive about what had happened. And that's what happens when there's leadership. And I think the president took a really large risk for himself and for our country by throwing this action to Congress when he himself argued, and I think he's absolutely right, he has the legal authority without congressional authorization to take exactly the kind of action he has argued is necessary in Syria.
Very mixed messages from the president, which is